what's incorrect, what's statistically significant, what's statistically insignificant. Which begs the question, what would then be the cause of scientific disagreement? We can consider an analog to mathematics. People don't disagree on one number being larger than another. People don't disagree on the functions of arithmetic. So what should make science different? So I began looking into this question, and in addition to looking at the parameters of science itself and looking at moments, cases of disagreement within science, I also considered some higher level issues, looking at the philosophy of science, looking at the philosophical foundations that we use to build scientific methodology, and also looking at social factors at play in science. So what does science look like in the real world? Not just the idea of science, the sort of monolith of science that we have in our minds, being this beacon of truth that shines on humanity, but looking at what is science in society? What is science as we do science? So I looked at all of these different areas, all of these different angles of analysis, and I developed the following thesis, that scientific disagreement occurs usually within the parameters of science, but is often a reflection of philosophical and social diversity of contexts. What that means is that when people disagree about science, they often start talking about the science itself. So if you see an article refuting another particular body of work, generally the contents of that article refers to controls, to protocols, to the way that the conclusions were drawn within a more express scientific fashion. But if we look a little bit deeper, in some cases it seems to be the case that the scientific disagreement itself is in some cases almost a layer on top, and then underneath there are broader disagreements, or to use a more neutral term, there's a diversity of philosophical and social contexts that will predispose a person to take a certain position regarding a certain scientific idea. So we're going to dive in all three of these areas. So the way that I broke this down is I considered different factors of disagreement. Right? So the idea is not that there's simply one overarching reason that people disagree, but that there are several different factors that can promote disagreement. And I broke it down into these three categories that I went over earlier. First, the scientific factors of disagreement, those concerning the actual scientific discourse itself. Philosophical factors of disagreement, so those concerning scientific philosophy, things of a more philosophical nature. And then social factors, as I said, relating to how science operates in the real world, or sort of that boundary point between society and science, or the boundary between culture and human life and science being this more abstract goal that we have. So we can start with the scientific factors of disagreement, and we'll go from there and see how that kind of segues into the philosophical and the social factors. So for scientific factors of disagreement, I kind of broke this down in a pretty simple fashion following a general understanding of the scientific method as we understand it. You start with a hypothesis, you design an experiment, you conduct the experiment and generate results, and then you develop field-wide findings, right? Or several experiments are conducted and you have sort of field-wide findings. So if we were going to look at scientific factors of disagreement, you could have people disagreeing over the hypothesis, which would be basically different speculation, different forecasts. There's not really a rigorous set of data people are drawing on at that point. They're kind of just forecasting different things. It's probably the least interesting of these ones right here. Right, so somebody saying Q will not occur. In terms of experimental design, this would be people disagreeing on whether an experiment would or would not demonstrate a particular conclusion. And then the analysis of the results would be kind of the other side of that coin, sort of two halves of the whole. Somebody stating that the data that was produced by an experiment doesn't demonstrate the particular proposed idea. And then the field-wide findings would be, right, sort of an extrapolation of that. Somebody saying that this field has not demonstrated Q, right? That a particular phenomenon has not legitimately been demonstrated within a particular scientific field. Now what's interesting as we look at this is that experimental design and analysis of results, those really are kind of the core of scientific methodology. What is it that we're doing when we do science? What are the protocols? What are the processes of science? And what do we do with those results to determine whether they're telling us something or not? And what's interesting about scientific methodology is that it's very tightly interlaced with philosophical roots. So philosophy of science and scientific methodology are very, very close bedfellows, so to speak. We'll talk more about this in a little bit. And then additionally, in terms of field-wide findings, this would be sort of an extrapolation of the analysis of results taken to a macroscopic perspective. And additionally, there's likely to be some social factors in place there, because it's generally not the case that people will read up on a number of different eclectic scientific findings to make sure that they have the most up-to-date ideas on a particular field, but often people will simply emulate the ideas, the perspectives, the philosophies of their peers regarding a particular field of knowledge. So at this point, we're looking at these factors of disagreement, and let's not consider what I mentioned yet about philosophy or society, but just look at it from here and think about science from a very superficial standpoint. If we consider these disagreements occurring, we're at a little bit of a crossroads. We have a choice. If science is uniform and unambiguous, kind of what I mentioned, it's a single unified methodology, you put in the input, you get the output, it's a green light, go, it's a red light, it's no good, then it would mean that disagreement means somebody messed up. Somebody didn't really do their job correctly, because if you follow the scientific protocol and it's objective and unambiguous, you should pretty much come to the same conclusion every single time. And in some cases, sure, that's probably the case. But if we look deeper and we look at the literature, we see that there's a very strong case to be made that science is not uniform and science is not unambiguous. What that means is that the scientific method or scientific methodology, or what it means to do science, is going to look very different depending on the phenomena that you're examining, depending on the context of your analysis, depending on what tradition of knowledge or what scientific tradition you're coming from, it's going to actually look quite different. And additionally, there are several aspects of ambiguity. And what that means is the relationship between science and truth with a capital T is complicated. It's not quite as simple as sometimes is put forth in the public sector or in the public, sort of in the public sphere. So what this would mean is that to a certain degree, necessarily, or as it currently stands, science tolerates some level of arbitrariness and ambiguity, which means there's at the core of science some aspects of arbitrariness, meaning particular decisions that are made that don't necessarily have to be exactly that way. So it's not that science had to be exactly that way, but maybe we chose to go in this direction, but theoretically we could have chosen to go in another direction. We'll look at an example of that in a little bit, as well as the ambiguity I just mentioned. One of the first compelling examples to demonstrate this sort of arbitrariness or ambiguity is the fact that science can be understood in some respects as a form of applied philosophy. If we consider science to be an investigation of truth, or science to be a project of determining truth, or generating truthful statements about the world that we live in, then ultimately the roots of science are in philosophy. Because since truth itself is an abstract concept, it would therefore only exist within an abstract context. So to understand the nature of truth, to consider what is true, what is untrue, we need to go to philosophy to understand that, because truth is essentially a philosophical concept. In addition, philosophy, more specifically in this case, the philosophy of science, would offer the means of determining truth. And then from this, science is built on top of a sort of philosophical foundation to pursue the truth according to certain philosophical ideas about what truth is, what truth looks like. How do you know if it's true versus an illusion? And applying these means to determine the truth. What's an acceptable way of determining truth? And this leads us naturally to consider the philosophical factors of disagreement. So to continue forward, from the philosophical standpoint, we can consider differences of scientific methodology, or what is or is not acceptable scientific methodology, to be philosophical in nature. Because debates, considerations, right, as I mentioned, about what is truth, how to get to truth, how to reveal truth within a particular context, really refer back to a philosophical point of view. A very good example of this, or interesting example of this perhaps, is in the 20th century. Right here we'll compare and contrast. We have the famous philosopher of science Karl Popper of the 20th century, whose main metric for what makes something scientific is if it can be disproven, right? If something can be disproven through experimentation, then it therefore makes it suitable to be understood and considered through the realm of science. Likewise, in the 19th century, you had Max Weber, one of the forefathers of social sciences, one of the forefathers of sociology. And he had a very, very different standpoint, actually kind of directly opposed. And he said, well, if we want to understand society, the most appropriate way to understand it is not to look at numbers, not to look at these empirical data, but actually to try to understand the subjective meaning that people attach to their actions within society. And if you don't look at the subjective meaning of the actors within society, you're never really going to understand what society is or what society is about. Whether a person disagrees or agrees with one particular methodology, it's kind of a personal thing, but ultimately it's a philosophical disagreement. If a person says, we need to be empirical to be scientific, I'm going to throw away the possibility of looking at a person's internal state or their internal sense of meaning as being admissible scientific data. It's not to say one side is wrong or right, but just to say that that does belong to a philosophical standpoint, and in a sense it's pre-scientific in a sense, or it's something that is more proper to this sort of philosophical foundation. Next we have difference of paradigm, and this is kind of an extension of difference of methodology. We'll talk more about paradigms in a moment. Many of you are familiar with the concept of the paradigm, which was introduced by Thomas Kuhn in 1962 in Structures of Scientific Revolutions. And a difference of paradigm would be like having a different instance, a different crystallized instance of scientific methodology, almost like you're using a different scientific operating system from somebody else. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. So this would be like somebody saying, look, this is not my science. So a molecular biologist may look at Max Weber's form of sociology and say, look, that's certainly not my science. Or they may say more directly, well, that's not science. But really, in a sense, they're saying it's not my science. And then last, we have ideology, or an admissible subject. So somebody saying, that subject is not open for debate, or that research is bogus. In the case of that second one, I have it here in the description here, we can consider as well when people, or I sort of put it in here, an insistence on larger level narratives. Because individuals both have ideas about how the world works and how things are and are not, but then often a person's scientific idea or scientific worldview starts to connect with their idea of how society functions and how people act. So they start to build these narratives about, well, this is what science does, this is what science is like, these are the barriers to science, these are the problems, these are the people working against science, these are the people working for science, this is what good science looks like, this is what bad science looks like. So they develop these larger level narratives. We'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. But next we can talk a little bit about the paradigm. So as I mentioned, this is this particular concept of the paradigm was proposed by Thomas Kuhn in the Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And at the time, the concept was itself a little bit of a revolution by taking science, which was, and still is in many ways, regarded as kind of this monolithic, opaque institution, right? This thing that is in and of itself seen as almost the human embodiment of truth. And he brought it into a social perspective that, in some cases, relativized it a little bit, but at least helped us to understand what science is in the sense of a human context, right? Is science just this beacon of truth, or is it something more specific to specific social dynamics? So his concept of a paradigm was an accepted example of actual scientific practice, which includes law, theory, application, and instrumentation together, from which spring particular coherent traditions of scientific research. So what we have in this Kuhnian idea of a paradigm is really, like I said, a little bit of an operating system. It's a tool set, a set of ideas, a set of phenomena that are under investigation, an angle for investigating that particular phenomenon. And generally speaking, a paradigm is created by, it's generated, by one major work or by a major researcher or by a core group of major researchers. But then after that paradigm is established, it forms a template, which we have here on the third one. It forms a template that solves outstanding problems, but according to Kuhn, it's very important that this paradigm permits existing problems left to be solved. And this is where we move from what is called revolutionary science to normal science, in the notion that what we often call science, we use the shorthand science to mean scientific activity, often refers to what Kuhn called normal science, meaning something like puzzle solving, mop-up work of the established paradigm. So in a way, the revolutionary science creates a puzzle set with a particular set of protocols, a particular approach, a particular, sometimes philosophy behind it, right, because it is a methodology. And then a bunch of other people, a bunch of other researchers will then take what was done there and try to fill in the gaps. And they're very motivated by the desire to solve the puzzle. An example that Kuhn gave was that Newton's Principia had many shortfalls of precision, right? There were actually a lot of problems with Newton's Principia that when it came out, but the fact that there was this really coherent structure that subsequent researchers could piggyback on and use Newton's methodology of examining these phenomena and then build upon it actually led to a really prolific period of scientific advancement. A couple of things about the paradigm that really make it clear that this is one very clear way of understanding disagreement in science. is that scientists are generally not, or according to Kuhn, they don't generally seek to validate the paradigm. Right? They're inspired by the paradigm. They like the paradigm and they simply try to build on the paradigm, but they don't try to go back and say, was this paradigm ever right in the first place? At that point, the agreement is already, the agreement can be taken for granted. And the researchers don't seek new phenomena or new theories, and they're often seen to be intolerant of new paradigms invented by others. In the same way that maybe somebody using an Android is intolerant of an Apple phone, right? Because this is the way that I like to work, this is what I appreciate, this is what I'm used to. And also it becomes very personal, which we'll see in a moment with the ideology. This is how I see the world. And I don't necessarily appreciate a way that somebody else sees the world, which may be, in some cases, incompatible with my way of seeing the world. So that leads us to, oh, actually we have a little bit more about the methodology first. So some other roots of disagreement within philosophy are, as I mentioned, the contemporary paradigms. And one quick note on that as well, I kind of just covered this, right? So you have a particular paradigm, and this creates a diversity in your philosophical point of view. But in addition to this, one thing worth noting is that it's kind of noted in philosophy of science that there's no algorithm for picking a paradigm. There's no single way for saying, this is the right paradigm, this is the one you should go for, or that's a bad apple paradigm, don't go for that paradigm. In fact, we can think of an example where you might have a phenomenon or a set of phenomena, and maybe you have two competing paradigms. Maybe one of them is very elegant, and it's very intuitive, and it's very aesthetically pleasing in a sense. But maybe it only covers 40% of the phenomena that are under investigation. Maybe there's another paradigm, and it covers 70% of the phenomena under investigation, but it's much more bloated. It's not so fun to work with. It has a lot of exceptions and a lot of inelegant rule sets, involved with it. Right, so people might prefer to work with a simpler paradigm that might be more elegant, and maybe would grow to be a more comprehensive paradigm. But with the other one, which is more comprehensive, although less aesthetically pleasing, would that be the correct one to choose? There's really no right answer here, and that's one of the areas where, as I mentioned, we have particularity in the sense that we choose a particular path. It's not that we had to choose one particular paradigm or one particular path, but we simply did. It was just the choice that we made. And on that note, we can also consider historical choices. One example here, so when I say historical choices, I mean various choices that were made throughout history in the development of what we today call science. So what we today call science is a particular beast. It's a particular thing that was created over many different philosophical debates, many different developmental choices. It's not necessarily the case that our science had to be exactly this way. And it's possible that if we went to an alien planet that was equally advanced to us in terms of technology or in terms of science, in a sense, it may look quite different because they may have chosen to investigate things a very different way. So an interesting example is in the, I believe it was the 17th century, there was a sort of, there was a debate between, 17th century, yes, there was a debate between the followers of Francis Bacon, the Baconian empiricists, and the followers of René Descartes, the Cartesian rationalists. So Descartes wanted to proceed through understanding a universal form of truth through self-evident first principles, right? I think, therefore I am. And by building on these self-evident first principles, we'll have a core consensus body of knowledge that's common to all of humanity. And great, that would be the science. And then you had Francis Bacon who said, no, really, we need to observe clear phenomena right in front of us, and then we'll make observations based on those phenomena. Ultimately, the empiricists won out, and this led to a lot of what we today call science. But it's not necessarily the case that Bacon had to win. Could we conceive of another civilization where maybe Descartes went out and we'd have a much more philosophically oriented form of core scientific tradition? It could be possible, right? These are historical choices that we make. And then on the side of ambiguity, right, there's some big open questions in the philosophy of science, like what is science? There's actually not a single accepted definition for science that really clarifies exactly what it is and what it does. And depending on, as I mentioned, depending on the tradition that you're working with, it could look quite different from various research branch to various research branch. Additionally, does science portray nature, right? So again, this is an idea that's kind of prevalent in society, that science is this large monolith that tells us what nature is and how nature works. And to a certain degree, it's absolutely very, very effective. But at the same time, there's been research in the 20th century, such as nonlinear complexity or chaos theory and Gödel's incompleteness theorems, basically showing that what could be the natural order could be so complex that we couldn't conceivably order it faithfully or in a neutral way. So people have argued that any ordering we impose on the natural world is to a certain degree a choice. There's some subjectivity involved in every scientific paradigm or scientific modeling that we build. And then last we have what I mentioned earlier in terms of the ideologies and narratives. And these are ones that people are somewhat familiar with. The idea here is it's ideas about science, it's beliefs about science, what science is, how science works, and what science has shown that preclude that predispose people to take a certain side over another. So one of the most famous ones of these is what is known as scientism, which is basically when a person takes the provisional findings of science, right? And I say that because in a sense, science is always a provisional process. We're always developing data, developing models, but they're always being tested, always being refined, and they're always something that exists within a particular context, but could be explored, could be expanded, it could be transformed further. But the idea that somebody takes the contemporary scientific ideas and adopts it and says, this is the world, this is how the world works, and insists on it in a more emotional, more personal, almost in a spiritual way of seeing things. So that's something that many people have written about that before, scientism. And additionally, I've added a couple of larger level narratives that we can consider. And these are sort of things that I've observed, or some things that you may have observed as well with individuals, with the way that their philosophy of science involves larger level narratives concerning society. And one is what I call the mainstream induction hypothesis. And this is basically the hypothesis that if something's true, it should be there in the mainstream. And if something's not in the mainstream, it means it's not true, right? So a lot of people reason this way that, well, if it's really there, if all natural phenomena can be demonstrated, then it should be demonstrated to the scientific mainstream, and it would be naturally recognized by the scientific mainstream. And this is, in some cases, an individual may choose to disagree with an idea simply because it's fringe, simply because it's out there. Because in a sense, they're using this heuristic to say that, well, I think that all scientific realities should be exposed to the mainstream, so if it's in the fringe, that means it's not true, or it's not valid. And the second one is anti-scientific retrogression, is what I call it. And I read all different points of view in this when I was preparing for this project, this presentation, and I would note as well, right, I'm not necessarily like pulling for any particular side over another, really. I try to see the best in both sides, and you see that on both sides there's generally, I saw, what would be the word, right? Honest people, right? Authentic, good quality science happening on both sides, but nevertheless some impasses of points of view. But this idea of anti-scientific retrogression is what I call it, which is the idea that ideas outside the scientific mainstream are by nature superstitious, irrational, or folkloric, or pseudoscience, and that they are in fact a threat to the progress of science and the rationality of mankind. And this is the kind of narrative that would prompt some scientists to start trying to discredit as much as possible things outside of the mainstream, right? Things such as parapsychology and what have you. And the idea is that ultimately they're trying to defend science, but that this is a particular larger level narrative that may or may not be actually 100% correct. The last example of philosophical forms of disagreement, or the last thing I would like to mention here, is actually just a quote from Plato that I think illustrates well the ambiguity of science from a philosophical standpoint, and it kind of will segue us nicely into looking at the social factors. In the Platonic dialogue Theaetetus, Socrates provides three possible explanations for the nature of knowledge, and all of them fail. So by the end of the dialogue, Socrates has gone through all of these different possible ways for describing or defining what is knowledge, and they really don't get there. And Socrates concludes by saying, but if Theaetetus, you should ever conceive afresh, meaning if you ever thought to consider this topic again, you will be all the better for the present investigation, and if not, you will be soberer and humbler and gentler to other men, and will be too modest to fancy that you know what you do not know. So I like this idea that having a certain, a little bit more of an erudition, or a little bit more of an erudite appreciation for the philosophical ambiguity of science can help to make a person a more thoughtful scientist, but can also feed back into how they conduct themselves in society, which leads us nicely into the social factors of disagreement. And here I broke this down into personal disagreement, professional disagreement, and disagreement based on unavailability. So personal is cultural values or ideas associated with a concept. I'm not one of those people. So really reflecting sometimes the cultural or the group or the social pressure not to agree with a certain idea. I can even imagine that there are many researchers who might start to entertain an idea, but in their in their mind's eye, they can start to see their friends, their colleagues frowning at them for even entertaining such a notion, for even considering it to be true. My identity is at odds with that idea. So we can think of people that just, for example, consider themselves to be a militant atheist, and they're not even willing to consider the possibility of something, beyond the physical dimension, because really this is who they are. To a certain degree, who they are is not believing in that kind of thing. So this can certainly predispose a person to have a particular scientific point of view. Then we have professional factors, which are political or economic in nature primarily, right? A person could lose credibility or could lose funding. Very pragmatic, very straightforward. And then we have factors of unavailability, so a lack of availability to truly interrogate the ideas. And I would include in here a misconstrued or incomplete understanding. So there are some times where you'll hear people debating a particular idea, and one person just doesn't seem to have a full grasp of what's going on, or doesn't have a full grasp of the idea or the implications of the idea, and is to a certain degree perhaps disagreeing with it based on a somewhat of a fragmented idea of what it is. Right, so an example is I can't be bothered with that, which I can relate to that, right? I can't be bothered, I'm busy. And also, this is just an example, people saying, for example, I don't know if anyone said this, but somebody saying parapsychologists think Newton was wrong. I've heard things along these lines, the notion that if we're going to introduce a new paradigm into the existing paradigm, it's going to invalidate all of the previous work we've done. In fact, this sort of a perspective wouldn't actually be true, but it could be based on something of an incomplete understanding of what it is that they're disagreeing with. So one succinct way, one very direct way to help to understand these social factors, to kind of embody it, is to consider the scientific profession itself, or to look at sort of the life of a scientist, and consider how these different factors come into play. So one aspect is that throughout life, there's first and foremost a cultural acclimation and identification with the social entity of science. So make no mistake, right, when we say science, it's actually a complicated word. It's a little bit like Dr. Meacham's talk earlier today about consciousness. What do you mean by science, right? Do you mean mainstream scientific ideas? Do you mean scientific researchers? Or do you mean the scientific methodology? If so, which methodology? But there's also this social, cultural entity of science that we talk about, right? That you'll see people talking about. Science says this, scientists are saying that. And it often includes a very particular group, social, cultural identity. So people identify with science when they become more involved with science, and as well a particular interpretation of science, an idea of how it looks, how it works, what do scientists do, what do scientists concern themselves with. Second one, and this one's pretty important, is a redacted scientific narrative that's instilled through scientific textbooks. And this is another idea from Kuhn, who said that more than any other single aspect of science, the textbook has determined our image of the nature of science. The reason for this is, as scientific historians look at, and the phrase scientific historian is not a phrase that you hear very often because a lot of people aren't that interested in the history of science, but if you look at it, you find a lot of interesting things that might challenge your assumptions about what science is and how it works. But if you look at the history of science, you see very fragmented, very different traditions of knowledge. Then, up in the 20th century, in more recent times, you have these textbooks that take the core findings of them and make them homogeneous, right? They make them uniform and put them all in a didactic learning tool that we call the textbook. So people take the textbook and they take that knowledge and they come away with an understanding, well, that's what science is. That's how science works. But in reality, the reality of scientific work can look extremely different from this concept of a unified linear progression that people develop while reading a scientific textbook. Additionally, there's, especially today, more and more increasing emphasis on specialization, which also emphasizes developing things in a more technical sense, right? So there's very little emphasis on developing the better and better philosophical viewpoint on science. There's, in our culture today, in our society today, there's a very strong emphasis on technical specialization. As mentioned earlier, the paradigm is not questioned, but simply fleshed out. And philosophy of science is overlooked. So this is also something that people are noticing, that philosophy of science is not something that attracts a lot of attention. Not a lot of people study philosophy of science. So even this idea that I'm talking about, where science is kind of like a form of applied philosophy, would seem very alien, very foreign to a lot of scientists because they haven't considered the philosophical background of it. Science is, in many cases, seen as absolute, beyond culture and society, right? Almost like you have different cultural, different social institutions, but then you have science often its own special privileged location, not really to be questioned because it is the single source of truth, in a sense. Moving along, scientific work being interdependent on a social network, kind of what I mentioned earlier, right? So these professional factors that can impinge a person, your colleagues, your superiors, your subordinates, you really become part of a very entangled social network, and it can certainly complicate a person's profession to start going along with any scientific idea that interests them, right? And that's even going to predispose them to prefer certain ideas over others. Scientific work, likewise, right? The other side of it is interdependent on the marketplace, in particular, sources of grants and funding. And another note on this, I researched some blogs about people talking about life as a professional scientist and making a mistake. It's actually a very hard life. It's a life where really you're trying to succeed, and just trying to succeed is hard enough in and of itself without trying to follow your passion and also succeed in an academic sense, right? Additionally, in terms of the unavailability, scientists often have to work long hours following elaborate technical protocols. It's not unusual for scientists to have to work weekends, evenings, holidays. From this perspective, right, they may not have the mental or creative energy to want to explore new ideas because they're already burned out from their day-to-day job. But additionally, they may be that less inclined to listen to people who probably haven't put in as much work as they have into a scientific tradition. Somebody who maybe has just read a couple books and wants to tell them about near-death experiences or OBEs, and they say, look, I've been doing this for so many years of my life. Why would I want to hear your perspective on this, right? No offense. So that could be another factor as well. So that wraps up the various factors of disagreement. So how do we resolve the disagreement? Certainly, this is a very complex scenario, and in the same way that there's no single reason that disagreement occurs, right? There's going to be many, many different possibilities to cultivate agreement, greater, and to progress science in a more consensus format in the future. But probably the biggest thing that stands out to me from reading all of these different, texts is to really promote trust and civil exchange, right? So that individuals are able to challenge the narratives of ignorant pseudoscientists or bigoted scientists on one hand. Because if you look at the individuals on both sides, it might not be the case that a person's sometimes stereotypes of a person they're disagreeing with, they may not match up with reality, for example. Promoting a healthy compatibility crisis through inter-identification. That's to say, for example, an individual might be a molecular biologist, but also spend time with a spiritual circle doing things that really don't agree with that other paradigm. And to a certain degree, we can have a crisis where we have to reconcile these two things that are very important to us and force us to find some higher ground, to find some internal agreement, only then maybe being able to help others to see the compatibility that we found. And also recognizing social networks as the space in which science operates. So I didn't get to talk about this too much, but the idea that really scientific methodology, scientific work, is very much embedded within social practices, right? So to be a scientist, what is it? It's to understand these technical, sometimes philosophical ideas, yes, on an intellectual level, but there's a tremendous practical component of knowing your way around a laboratory, having the networks, knowing how to work with the individuals to develop progress of the scientific field, being a social enterprise, right? Being a group and social enterprise. So seeing that, in a sense, right, science might only be considered half intellectual and the other half could be considered social. That could certainly help us to reconcile some of the differences by emphasizing sometimes more of the relationships that we have in science. And I'll end with this quote by Stephen Chapin, who articulates well this idea of trust. Trust is quite literally the great civility. Mundane reason is the space across which trust plays, right? So the notion that reason is not this thing that we're talking about. We're actually transmitting trust to and from one another, and reason is simply the space where this trust and social cohesion is occurring. It provides a set of presuppositions about self, others, and the world which embed trust and permit both consensus and civil dissensus to occur. So without trust, there will be, in a sense, no consensus and no civil dissensus. Okay, guys, that's it for my time. Thank you very much. I forgot that I'm introducing the next speaker. So joining us now at the podium is Dr. Federico Fagin. Federico Fagin received his doctorate in physics from the University of Padua, Italy, and later moved to Simi Valley, California. He is known for his contributions to technology, including the world's first microprocessor and personal voice and data communication system. Thanks to his work, we get to enjoy the touch screens on our mobile devices. He developed the design and methodology for all early Intel microprocessors, and also developed dozens of memory chips and other integrated circuits at several companies. Dr. Vagine has received many awards and honors, among them the 2009 National Medal of Technology and Innovation from President Obama. He is now president of the Federico and Elvia Vagine Foundation, which is dedicated to the scientific study of consciousness. He is here to present physical reality, the fundamental nature of reality, physical reality as language. Welcome.
Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to lower my voice, please. It's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about a model of reality with the potential of explaining both inner and outer reality. You know, physics investigates the outer physical reality by creating mathematical models of observational data, inventing falsifiable theories, and performing a variety of experiments. However, we experience both an inner and an outer world. The inner world of feelings, meaning, and so on, and the outer world of physical reality and other people, other objects. This is the mind-body problem that has really had our ancestors already worried about for, since the recorded history. It was explained recently, in the last 300 years, by Cartesian dualism until 100 years ago, where the mind-body were supposed to be made by two different substances. When the organic matter of living organisms was found to have the same properties of compounds that were synthesized in the laboratory with atoms and molecules that belong to inanimate matter, physicalism began to take over. And physicalism is a monistic model where everything that exists is matter-energy acting in space-time. Within physicalism, the inner experience is explained as an emergent property of a complex system made of atoms. Physicalists claim that since everything is made of the same atoms and molecules, we do not need to invoke the existence of an ill-defined substance of the mind to explain inner experience. Inner experience is simply what the brain does. However, nobody can actually explain how inner experience can possibly emerge from the electromagnetic and electrochemical signals that course through the brain, or the rest of the body, for that matter. If the brain is truly like a computer, how come that we are